Part 1. The Dream That Took Root. It started with a dream. 15 acres, golden light, chickens in the yard, and fruit trees so full they bowed with promise. She was finally home. But the peace didn't last. In her mid-40s, she had finally made it. After years of sacrifice, saving, and starting over more than once, she and her husband signed the papers and walked across the threshold of their fixer-upper farmhouse. It was nestled between low hills and cradled by old oak trees, with a rickety porch that leaned a little too far west, and windows that still held the fingerprints of time. But it was theirs. The kind of place they had only whispered about in city apartments, or while driving past for sale signs on dusty back roads. Now it was real. Now it was home. 15 acres stretched around them, wide and full of possibility. Chickens pecked at the grass by the end of the first week. By the third, rabbits had their own hutch, and the goats arrived just after that. Two all-stubborn does that quickly became the center of daily chaos and laughter. Fruit trees dotted the southern slope. Apples, peaches, cherries, plums, apricots, and pears. They weren't producing much yet, but the blooms had been glorious in spring. A promise of abundance to come. It felt like a little Eden in the making. She still worked full-time in IT. Her job kept them afloat. Remote work mostly, but regular travel too. While she built systems and solved technical crises for companies across the region, her husband built fences, dug irrigation trenches, and learned how to keep the goats from escaping. He turned the garage into a workshop and figured out how to convert a section of the barn for winter hay storage. She woke up early, logged in, drank her coffee with one eye on her laptop and one ear tuned to the bleating outside. They worked hard. They were tired, but they were happy. The community welcomed them slowly, cautiously. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knows who used to own the house before you did, and where reputations stretched longer than roads. But the church was warm, kind. Members dropped off goat feed when they heard the couple had run out early. Someone donated a tiller for the orchard. The couple brought fresh eggs to potlucks and homemade apple butter to ladies' luncheon gatherings. They learned names, showed up at service projects, and slowly, gently, became known. There was something sacred about the rhythm of their days. The morning prayers on the porch swing, the scent of wood smoke at dusk, the joy of watching a goat kid take its first wobbly steps. They often fell asleep with aching backs and full hearts. It wasn't easy, but it was beautiful. They spent Saturdays mending fence, clearing brush, and hauling compost. Sundays were for rest, homemade cinnamon rolls, walks through the orchard, hymns sung quietly at sunset. Sometimes neighbors would stop by with extra vegetables or stories about the land's history. One elderly man said the orchard had once belonged to a widow who raised 7 children alone. That stuck with her. She wondered what legacy they might leave behind. She started naming the trees, not out loud, but in her mind. The one by the bend in the fence became Ruth. The tall pear that bloomed early every year was Deborah. She marked the seasons with their progress, celebrated small things like the first egg from a new hen, or the goats learning to follow voice commands. There was something deeply human about watching life grow, where you had once only seen overgrowth and weeds. Then January came. The news was still a murmur at first, a sickness overseas. Something about China. Something about a new virus. But by February, it was closer. Seattle, California, New York. In March, the world changed. Flights stopped. Clients canceled. Conferences were postponed indefinitely. And just like that, the job that had paid for everything, the animals, the trees, the land itself, was gone. First, she held it together. She thought, I can figure this out. She was used to solving problems. She'd navigated data migrations with no backup plans and written recovery scripts in the middle of the night. Surely she could figure this out. She started a freeze-dried candy business out of the kitchen. It made sense. They had fruit. She had tech savvy. People wanted novelty during lockdown. She bought a freeze dryer on credit, learned packaging, figured out a small batch workflow. Orders came in from neighbors, then friends of friends. She built a tiny website and set up online payments. Maybe this could work. And for a moment, it did. Then COVID hit their area hard. Her part-time helpers got sick or had to isolate. Shipping delays left her without labels. Packaging supplies were on backorder. Customers stopped responding. Some days, she stared at rows of jars on the counter and didn't know whether to cry or push through. She usually did both. The chickens still needed feeding. The goats didn't care that business was slow. Her laptop sat closed more days than not. She applied for jobs, but no one was hiring someone who couldn't travel. There were no more commutes to the airport. No more hotel rooms. No paychecks. They started selling things off. Her spare monitor, old cameras, an extra set of tires they were saving for the truck. They rationed every dollar. They bought animal feed in bulk and stretched groceries with rice and beans. Some nights, dinner was just scrambled eggs and home-canned peaches. But they gave thanks anyway. She took to journaling again. Not about work or worries, but about what she was learning. How to stretch meals, how to make do, how to listen to the still small voice that whispered through the worst days. She wrote prayers in the margins, scriptures on sticky notes, a list of everything God had already brought them through. Some from the church checked in. They dropped off groceries. One woman from the ladies' luncheon brought her a quilt. But not everyone was kind. She overheard whispers. Someone said she should have been more prepared. Someone else joked about people playing farm instead of living in the real world. The words stung. She carried them into her prayers. She tried not to let it get to her. But when she was alone and the wind howled across the fields at night, she wondered if they'd made a mistake, if the dream had been too big, if she had trusted too much. The only thing that kept her going was the class. A few times a year, she taught IT certification classes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help cover the mortgage, enough to pay the electric bill, enough to buy feed for the animals if they rationed carefully. Each time she logged in to teach, she smiled through the screen, hoping her students couldn't see the worry behind her eyes. She spoke clearly, confidently. She taught protocols and best practices. Then she logged off, wiped her eyes, and washed the dishes by hand to save electricity. She kept a worn index card tucked into her Bible, one she'd written years ago. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. Lamentations 3:25. She would press her fingers to it each morning, sometimes whispering the verse aloud. Other times, she would just sit in silence, letting the words settle in like rain in dry soil. It wasn't just a reminder. It was an anchor. One morning in May, she dropped to her knees beside the couch. The bank account had dipped below $100. The goats had broken another section of fencing. Her phone sat silent on the table. Lord, she whispered, I'll wait. But please don't let us lose this. They made it through spring. She taught another class. Her husband bartered labor for lumber and reinforced the goat pen. A neighbor with too many chicks gifted them 4 more hens. She made jam out of the last of the plums and traded it for propane. They fixed the leaking roof with spare shingles someone had left at the dump. Every day was a patchwork miracle. They laughed sometimes. At the goats. At themselves. At the absurdity of baking bread on a camp stove during a power outage. Hope showed up in strange places. A handwritten card in the mailbox, a jar of pickles from the neighbor, a single $50 Venmo from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Some evenings, they sat by the orchard in silence, watching the trees sway under the weight of new fruit. She would listen to the wind and wonder how long they could hold on. But deep down, she believed they would. She had to. There were still hard moments. Days when she fought back tears while making breakfast. Nights when her husband paced quietly, not wanting to wake her, but unable to sleep. But there were also quiet victories, a healthy goat birth, a jar of jam that sealed just right, a student who emailed to say her class helped him land a job. By summer, they were making it. Barely. But then came July 20th. The sky turned orange, and everything they'd fought for was about to go up in flames. Stay tuned for part 2, when the sky turned orange. Part 2. when the sky turned orange. It started as a whisper, just like the virus had. The wind carried the smell of smoke before anyone saw it. July 20th was already hot by 9 a.m., the kind of dry, tense heat that made even the bees seem irritable. She noticed it first when she went to check on the goats. They were restless, shifting and snorting more than usual. The air felt different. Off. By noon, the sky had dimmed into an eerie orange. Not sunset, something stranger. The light filtered down like the world was behind a veil. It made everything look sepia-toned, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. That's when they saw the plume, a thick column of smoke rising just beyond the ridge. The fire had started a mile away. At first there wasn't panic. Fires happened out here. The county had protocols. The volunteer fire department had good equipment. But then came the alert. Level 1 evacuation. Be ready. It rattled her chest like a drumbeat. They packed slowly at first. Important papers. Medications. Her laptop. Their wedding album. Phone chargers. Some clothes. The cat carrier. Then they started thinking about the animals. The chickens. Rabbits. The goats. There wasn't a lot of time, and there was no way to bring them all unless they had somewhere to go. The county fairgrounds opened their gates for livestock evacuees. Her husband hitched the trailer while she loaded water bottles and feed. The goats went first, then the rabbits in carriers, then the chickens in crates. One cat bolted from under the porch and disappeared into the brush. Her heart cracked at the sound of her own voice calling out, over and over, "Socks, come here, baby." But the cat was gone, vanished into the dry brush. No trace. No answering cry. She searched until the smoke stung her eyes, and the heat made it impossible to go farther. Each step away from the house felt like betrayal, like leaving behind a family member. She had to force herself into the truck, whispering one last prayer that somehow he would find his way back. By 3 p.m., the alert changed to level 3. Go now. Mandatory evacuation. The words flashed across their phones with an urgency that made her stomach drop. The fire had jumped the ridge, leaped like a living thing with no intention of stopping, and was headed straight toward their property. She heard sirens in the distance, echoing across the valley. Neighbors began pulling out of driveways, some with strollers rattling behind them, some with tears streaming down their faces as they waved goodbye without knowing if they'd ever return. The air felt electric, charged with fear. What had been careful planning, slow and methodical, dissolved in an instant. What had been caution turned into chaos. Inside the house, she moved on instinct, grabbing things she hadn't thought of before. Socks, batteries, her favorite sweater from the closet. Her husband shouted for her to go, that it was time, and still she hesitated. One more glance at the living room, at the walls they had painted by hand. It all looked too still, too sacred to leave. They grabbed what they could, throwing in toiletries, blankets, a few precious books. Her favorite coffee mug shattered in the sink as she rushed to turn off appliance. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorknob. For a split second, habit told her to lock it. But then she remembered what the firefighters had said. Leave doors unlocked, in case they needed to get inside to stop the flames. So she left it open. It felt strange, unnatural, like leaving your heart vulnerable. But there was trust in it too, a surrender to those fighting to protect what they could. They drove north, toward a church friend's property, a family with a barn apartment they had offered up weeks earlier during fire season prep. We hope you never need it, they'd said. Now they did. As they drove away, she looked back only once. The sky behind them was thick and furious, and the road shimmered with heat. Smoke curled into the treetops. She whispered Psalm 91 under her breath, those ancient words that had comforted generations before her. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day. She repeated the lines she remembered, clinging to them like a lifeline, until she ran out of verses and just kept saying, Please, Lord, please. The next 72 hours unraveled her. The apartment above the barn was small, one room with a kitchenette and a couch that folded out into a bed. The kindness of the gesture was immense, but so was the weight of being displaced. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made her jump. Her body was in the apartment, but her heart was still on the land. They checked updates obsessively. Local fire maps, Facebook groups, calls to the sheriff's office, photos taken by neighbors. Her stomach churned every time she saw a new image, flames dancing too close to roads she knew by name. One photo showed a mailbox that looked just like theirs, barely standing beside scorched ground. She replayed their last steps in her mind again and again. Did we close the chicken coop? Did I leave the gate open? Was there enough water in the troughs? Every small choice felt heavy in retrospect, as if the outcome might still be rewritten if she could just remember every detail right. Sleep was a luxury they didn't have. Her husband dozed in fits. She lay awake, holding a flashlight, like it might stop the world from falling apart. She thought about the house, the animals, the orchard. Would the trees survive? Would the fence burn? Had they left the windows open? On the second night, she sobbed in the car parked beside the barn. Alone, in the dark, she let out everything she had held in. The fear, the guilt, the powerlessness. A friend texted that evening to say she was praying. That helped. Not much, but enough. In a moment when she felt invisible and powerless, those simple words reminded her that someone else was holding her up in prayer, that heaven was still listening, even when she couldn't find the words herself. It was like being passed a flashlight when yours has just gone out, small but powerful in the darkness. She felt like a failure, for not being more prepared, for not finding the cat, for needing help. Her pride ached almost as much as her heart. She kept going over everything they could have done differently. More water stored, a better fire plan, extra carriers. But hindsight is a cruel teacher. It never shows up until the test is already underway. She remembered one night, early in their homesteading journey, when she and her husband had talked about worst-case scenarios. They laughed about zombie apocalypses and economic collapse. But wildfires had always been the one that silenced them. Fire doesn't ask. It just takes. She journaled during the wait, short entries scrawled into the margins of an old calendar. The wind is picking up. Goats are safe, praise God. I miss my home. It wasn't poetic, but it was real. And then, on the third day, the call came. The firebreak had held. The winds had shifted. The firefighters had gained ground. Their property was still standing. The tears she cried then were different, softer, holy. They returned to the fairgrounds first. The goats bleated in recognition. The chickens had lost some feathers but were safe. The rabbits looked dazed but unharmed. One of the volunteers was a girl from church, a teenager who had bought candy from her at the town fair the summer before. I remember you, the girl said. You gave me samples even when I didn't have money. Her mom helped them load cages and crates, offering warm smiles and a thermos of ice-cold water. That night, they pulled into their driveway. Ash blanketed the porch. The air still smelled like a campfire. But the house stood, just as they had left it. A few singed leaves, a crack in a window pane. That was all. She stepped inside, dropped her bag, and fell to her knees. Thank you, was all she could say. Over and over. Thank you for the house still standing. Thank you for the orchard spared. Thank you for the animals safe at the fairgrounds. Thank you for the neighbors who prayed, for the strangers who welcomed them, for the wind that shifted. Thank you for the firefighters who stood between the flames and their home. Thank you for grace she didn't deserve, and mercies she hadn't even seen yet. The hardwood floor felt like sacred ground. 2 days after the fire was contained, she opened the front door to let in air, and there he was, socks, skinny, dirty, meowing, like he had something to say. And then, like a miracle written in fur, the missing cat returned. The sight of him, scraggly and soot-smudged but very much alive, hit her like a wave. Relief crashed through her. wild and tearful. In that moment, all the fear and guilt she had carried about leaving him behind melted into something softer. Socks had survived. He had made it home. And somehow, that small silent victory made everything feel a little more whole. He was proof that not everything lost stays lost. That sometimes God returned what your heart had mourned too early. She scooped him up and sat on the porch, crying into his fur. He purred like he'd never left. Her husband came out with tears in his eyes and said softly, "We're all home now." They didn't unpack everything right away. It took days to feel normal again. Even the normal didn't feel the same. It was quieter, more reverent. Every dish she washed, every chair she straightened, felt like a small act of praise. She wandered the property the first evening, checking on every tree, every fence piece, every little sign of life. A few of the apricot leaves were curled and brown, but the rest stood tall. Even the fragile cherry sapling had survived. She whispered a thank you at the base of every tree. For a long time, she couldn't walk through the orchard without scanning the treetops for smoke. The crackle of dry grass made her flinch. She didn't talk much in those first weeks. Her husband filled the silence with practical things, mending fence, fixing irrigation lines, calling the insurance company. They bought new smoke detectors, talked about clearing more defensible space, planted fire-resistant shrubs. She started lighting a candle in the evenings, something she'd never done before. Not for the scent, but for the stillness. One night, she sat watching its flicker for nearly an hour, her Bible open beside her, untouched, as if the flame itself was the prayer. But something inside her was different. The fire had left a mark. Not on the house, on her. Still, the goodness of God had carried them through. At the next ladies' luncheon, someone handed her a bouquet of wildflowers. Another brought extra canning jars. Someone she didn't know well slipped her a grocery gift card and whispered, "You were in our prayers." She smiled, said thank you. And that night, she wrote each of their names in her journal. Not to remember what they gave, but to remember that she wasn't alone. She still didn't have a full-time job. The candy business wasn't coming back. But the class schedule picked up. A few more sessions, a few more students. Just enough. God had always been a God of just enough. And deep inside, though she was still shaken, something else had taken root. Faith. Not just the kind you say, but the kind you live when the worst happens. The kind that watches fire lick the edge of everything you built and still whispers, "Even now, God is good." She taped a new verse above the kitchen sink. Isaiah 43:2. "When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." The verse wasn't a promise of ease. It was a promise of presence. She had seen it, felt it, lived it. And she knew, whatever came next, she would not walk alone. Stay tuned for Part 3. The Fire That Refined Us. Part 3. The Fire That Refined Us. They were safe, but nothing felt normal. Safety doesn't undo trauma. It only gives it a place to land. And for days, the weight of everything they'd just survived hung in the air like leftover smoke. The smell lingered, clinging to the walls of their home, the cushions of the old porch swing, and the clothes they'd hastily thrown into laundry baskets on the way out. It was subtle but persistent. Every time she walked into a room, she would pause, breathe in, and remember. That scent became a memory trigger, awakening fear even in calm moments. She began washing everything twice, even the clean things. The orchard had mostly survived, but the edges were scorched. Several rows of wild blackberries on the far side of the fence had been swallowed by the fire. Her favorite wild roses had been reduced to ash. She walked those edges daily, hands trailing over what was left, praying for new growth, but also grieving the losses that couldn't be undone. Her feet kicked through patches of charred grass, and she sometimes knelt beside the blackened trunks, whispering, "I'm so sorry," as if the land could hear her. The days blurred. Her body worked like clockwork, feeding the animals, checking fence, watering the trees. But her soul moved more slowly. Sleep still came in fits, interrupted by nightmares she couldn't quite remember, but woke from shaking. Once, she dreamed of fire pouring through the windows like water. Another time, she stood in her living room while smoke rolled in, under the door. And no matter how hard she tried to scream, no sound came out. Her husband tried to stay upbeat, but she saw it in his eyes. The way he lingered just a little longer in the barn. How he kept the emergency radio plugged in even after the danger had passed. He checked the wind forecasts every morning. They both did. He began drafting a better fire plan. He built a new emergency kit, labeled every bin, added backup chargers, ordered a fireproof safe. Preparing wasn't just practical anymore. It was healing. And yet, the ordinary acts of living slowly started to feel holy. Hanging laundry on the line, sweeping ash off the porch, canning peaches that somehow ripened right on time. Each small act was like a defiant prayer. We are still here. At night, she sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, a notebook on her lap. She wrote things she hadn't planned to write. Memories from childhood, verses from Psalms, dreams that now felt distant. She wrote letters to God that began with, "I don't understand," and often ended with, "But I trust you." It took 3 weeks before she let herself sit alone in the orchard, the same spot where she used to journal each day, and price new planting ideas. That afternoon, she brought a blanket and let herself sit in the quiet. No music, no phone, no list of things to do. Just her, the breeze, and the trees that remained. She cried then. Not the frantic sobs from evacuation, but the kind that cleans out your spirit. The kind that leaves you lighter afterward. It wasn't just relief. It was release. Grief for the things they'd lost. Gratitude for what they still had. And something else. A flicker of resilience taking root. That evening, as the sun melted into the western hills, she lit a small fire in their outdoor fire pit. It was the first fire they'd built since the evacuation. They sat together in silence, watching the flames dance. Tamed now. Peacefully. The irony wasn't lost on her. Fire had taken so much. But fire also gave warmth, beauty, light. Like so many things, it could destroy or refine. It depended on how you met it. The following Sunday, they went back to church. It felt awkward at first, like returning to a place where time had moved forward without them. But people smiled, hugged them, asked how they were doing. Not in the small talk kind of way, but in the way that meant, "We saw the smoke. We prayed for your flame." During the service, she barely heard the sermon. But one verse struck her. Zechariah 13:9. "I will bring the third part through the fire. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them." It wrapped around her like a shawl. Through the fire. Not around it. Through. Afterward, a woman she barely knew approached her in the foyer. "You probably don't remember," she said, "but years ago, you came to my house with a group and brought freezer meals after my husband's accident." The memory came back in fragments, a casserole, a prayer on the porch. "Well," the woman said, her voice catching, "I've been praying for you since the fire started. That same casserole is coming back your way." They both laughed and cried. It felt like a full circle moment. Kindness that had rippled out and returned, like a boomerang of grace. The generosity didn't stop there. One of her students from an IT class reached out to ask if she'd consider consulting part-time for their company. The pay wasn't great, but it was flexible and consistent. It was enough to cover hay and propane. A local store offered to stock a few of her homemade jumps from last year's harvest. A friend donated extra firewood. Someone else dropped off a new set of garden gloves, saying, "For whatever you plant next." She didn't call these things coincidences anymore. She used to think of them as luck, or maybe the result of quiet kindnesses being read. But now, after the fire, she saw them differently, like breadcrumbs left by God. Signs she was still being led. Reminders that she wasn't forgotten, not even in the ashes. These blessings arrived not just as help, but as healing, as sacred proof that heaven saw them and had not looked away. There was a morning, about a month after the fire, when she walked the property alone. Mist hung low over the grass. Her boots were damp with dew. She paused beside the orchard and noticed something small, a single rosebud, growing out of the charred remains of a wild rose bush. It was pink, tender, alive. She bent down and cupped it in her palm. It felt like a message. Not everything that burns dies. Some things come back. Some mornings, she still woke with anxiety in her chest. But more often now, she woke with resolve, with thanks, with a growing sense of purpose that maybe, just maybe, this season had shaped her into someone new. Not broken, not bitter, but deeper, rooted. She made a list one day. Things the fire taught her. What matters most isn't stuff. It's who you run to when everything is falling apart. Preparation is good, but surrender is better. You can survive more than you think. Even scorched ground can become holy. The cat, Socks, became more affectionate after the fire. He followed her around the house like a little shadow. One morning, he hopped onto the counter while she was canning pears and knocked a measuring spoon into the sink. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. That spoon clatter felt like music. She started telling their story to others, not dramatically, not for sympathy, but because stories heal, and because she wanted others to know. If you've been through the fire, you're not alone. Sometimes survival itself is the miracle. One night, months later, they hosted a small dinner under the stars. Just a few friends, string lights hanging between trees, goats bleating softly in the background, laughter rising like incense. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh rosemary lingered in the air. They shared stories, passed warm bread, and toasted with sparkling cider in mismatched mason jars. It wasn't fancy, but it was full. As the last guest left, her husband wrapped his arm around her and whispered, "We made it." She nodded, tears caught in her throat. They had. And not just through the fire, through the fear, through the waiting, through the ache of the unknown. The house was still standing. So was her faith. And that faith was stronger now, stretched and tested, but more alive than ever. It had been stripped of comfort and rebuilt with something sturdier. It had grown into a shelter, not just for herself, but for others she would one day comfort too. And though the ground didn't look quite the same, it held deeper roots now, roots that reached into something eternal, roots that wouldn't have grown without the fire. What had once been neat rows and wild hedges was now a mix of scorched earth and unexpected beauty. Some trees bore fruit more abundantly than they had in years past. The blackberry brambles that had been wiped out entirely began to sprout anew, thicker, greener, almost defiant in their return. Even the wild roses, reduced to ash that summer, pushed up new shoots by spring. It wasn't the same. It was different, better. The fire had taken, but it had also cleared space. Space for sunlight, space for renewal, space for deeper growth. Her land had healed, and so had she. Not all at once, not perfectly, but slowly, deeply, like roots pressing down through scorched soil in search of living water. The healing hadn't erased the memory of the fire, but it reframed it. What once felt like devastation had become holy ground for growth, for perspective, for purpose. A faith forged not in comfort, but in flame. Not in abundance, but in surrender. Not in ease, but in endurance. And that, she realized, was its own kind of miracle.